Welcome to our 8-week emphasis on the book of Job. And I have to tell you, when I first looked in the encounter material and realized we're doing 8 weeks in Job, to be followed up with 7 weeks in Ecclesiastes, I thought, oh my goodness, it's going to be a long, long slog. But actually, I've read through the lessons, and our author, George Estes, does a wonderful job of bringing it along and letting it progress. And we are all going to learn a lot about this book that all of us probably have some nominal belief in or understanding of or knowledge of, but we're going to learn so much more about how God works in the world, about how we work with God, about the ways that we can relate to God. And so I'm excited about this quarter's encounter material, and we begin with Job, and I want to begin with a quote from Brian McLaren. Brian McLaren is a pastor and an author. He wrote a book fairly recently called Do I Stay Christian? And it is trying to answer that very question for a number of people who look around and they see perhaps hypocrisy in the church and they don't want to be Christian. Perhaps they see the church trying to offer simplistic answers for complex problems, and they wonder, is there anything the church can offer us? Perhaps that they look at the church and see scandals and whatnot and just wonder, is it really worth it to stay Christian? How do I find my way in the world? And part of what he says in that book I really like. He says, no, I don't need the Bible as an inerrant revelation of simplistic answers so I can live in blissful denial about life's complexities and perplexities. Instead, I need it as a library of questions and arguments among communities of people who sought a better way of living in harmony with themselves, with one another, with the earth, and with God. And I love that idea that what he is looking for is a library of questions and arguments. And there is no better book than Job. It is full of questions and arguments. Some of them are good arguments and others are not good arguments. Job's friends are the ones that make the arguments that aren't particularly good arguments. And so as we are studying through, we'll see all of that. And a lot of the arguing is Job arguing and complaining to God, which is something some of us feel like maybe we should refrain from, but Job does that as well. And so I'm glad we're going to look at this book. I want us to kind of think a little bit about the fact that both Job and Ecclesiastes are part of the wisdom books in the Old Testament. The other ones are Psalms and Proverbs and the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. Together, all of those books make up the wisdom books in the Old Testament. But they're not wisdom books like you might think in terms of having a completely consistent message. They actually approach the same problems from different angles. This is where we are getting different communities with different questions and different arguments, and we're going to sift through them a little bit to see how they work in our lives and how they interplay with each other. Sometimes our lives simply just work. And we often hear people say correctly, I have worked hard and I have earned the things that I have earned, and I'm thankful that I learned the value of hard work, and it has benefited me greatly. And that's true. We can point to many people. I hope that's true for all of us at one level or another. We also have heard people no doubt say, I've learned to be faithful. And when I am faithful, God finds ways of blessing me, and I'm blessed for my faithfulness. And it's not necessarily that God is rewarding me, but when I'm faithful, I'm just led into reward. And that is also true. And that is both of those things are the promises of both Proverbs and the Song of Songs. That life works when we follow the rules, that life works when we do the things that we are supposed to do, and that there are ways that we can make sure that our lives are as good as possible. And the converse is true in those as well. Life is difficult for the wicked. And we know that is true, and yet let's be honest, we also know that in spite of the fact that we know that we indeed are wise, these are wisdom books, when we are faithful, when we work hard, when we live out that wonderful mandate that is in both the Old Testament and the New Testament to love God and to love our neighbor, those are not absolute guarantees of success. There have been times when I am sure it's true of you, it's been true of me, where we've worked hard and it hasn't gotten us anywhere. Hard work by itself didn't work. Where we were faithful, and we were very faithful, and yet that didn't exempt us from some tragedy or from some difficulty. When we have really sought to love God and love the neighbor, and it turned out to be a thing that caused us a lot more pain. It got us into trouble. And why wouldn't it? Jesus loved God and loved neighbor, and we see the kind of trouble he got in as well. And so those things are not like putting money in a slot machine, or not a slot machine, but in a vending machine and pushing the button and we get out whatever we want. Rather, it is a little more complex than that. And that is where Ecclesiastes and Job really come in. They come in and they're asking hard questions and suggesting that life is a little more complicated, and yet they are not denying the truth that we find in Proverbs and the Song of Songs. In fact, the way that John Goldingay, who is another theologian, puts it is Proverbs and the Song of Songs focus on the rules, on the order that characterizes human life, though they also acknowledge that life is not wholly predictable. Job and Ecclesiastes focus on the experiences that belie the rules, though they also acknowledge the rules. So we would be wise to follow the rules, and that is going to often lead us into the kind of lives that we want, but we need to recognize that that doesn't mean that we are guaranteed that, and that may bring up all kinds of questions for us, and we will get those questions in Job and in Ecclesiastes. I would argue that Psalms, I think, kind of bridges the gap between the two, because there are some Psalms, like Psalm 1, that says, "Blessed are the upright, blessed are those who do not walk in the counsel of the way of the wicked, and they are planted like trees by streams of water, and they are strong," and this kind of thing. But you also have Psalms like Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And so the Psalms kind of both ask the questions and also have the advice for us, and so they help us maybe in some way decide. Sometimes I need to pray that Psalm 1 prayer. Thank you, God, that my life is working right now and that everything I'm doing seems to be bringing glory to you, perhaps, and success to me, or whatever. And then sometimes we need to do the opposite and pray that Psalm 22. God, it feels like you're not there anymore. Why have you forsaken me? Why is my life so hard right now? So let's begin our 8-week time with Job by jumping right into the book. The first lesson is really Job 1 and 2, but our focal passage is Job 1 through 12. And so I want you to hear that passage now.
In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man amongst all the people of the East. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes on their birthdays, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular custom. One day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then. Everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord.
And so right out of the gate, we meet the central character of the book. We meet Job, and we are told immediately that he is an upright and blameless person, and we will talk more about what that means in a little bit. But let's talk a little bit about him and his story. The story is set in around the same time that Abraham lived. Job is not a Jew because there's no such thing as that yet. That's going to take Abraham and the covenant that God makes with Abraham for that to happen, and Job isn't a part of that. And yet he is a faithful person. For whatever reason, however, he knows about God and he is faithful to God. It's so touching to me the way that he prays to God and sacrifices on behalf of his children. What a wonderful father he is. What a faithful person he is. You already know the general outline probably of the story. He is a very wealthy man, has been blessed with many, many things. It is implied that he is blessed because he has been faithful. And then Satan tests Job with God's permission by causing terrible tragedies to befall him. His children are killed. He loses everything that he owns. When that doesn't cause him to curse God, Satan then asks God for permission to actually afflict his body. God permits that as well, and he has terrible boils and sores that appear on his body, and he is in terrible, terrible pain. And in spite even of his wife's advice that he curse God and die, Job retains his faith. Now, his faith is a gritty faith. It's a faith that is demanding of God. Some of the ways that Job addresses God would cause me to shake in my boots a little bit. But Job demands answers for what is going on. And he is absolutely convinced that although he is not sinless, and he never claims to be sinless, he has not done anything that was so bad that he should have had such terrible, terrible punishments visited upon him. He has 3 friends and then eventually a 4th who come to comfort him, and they sit with him for 7 days in sackcloth and ashes, saying absolutely nothing, and that was probably the best ministry they did for him. And then they open up their mouths and they keep trying to convince him, you know you did something. The universe just works, and so when you sin, you get punished, and you're being punished, and you need to confess, and Job just won't, and there's all these interchanges back and forth with them. Well, the overall theme, though, of all of Job's speeches is, I want an encounter with God. I want to get to plead my case before God and have God explain to me. And eventually he gets that encounter, although it isn't the encounter that he was expecting. You may remember when Elijah encounters the voice of God, there is a storm and an earthquake and a fire, and God isn't in any of those things. A great wind, God is not in that. And then God is in a still small voice. But Job encounters God in a tornado, in a whirlwind. And that's how he hears the voice of God. And Job ends up confessing that now he recognizes that God is too unknowable to be completely understood by the likes of him or by the likes of us. And then for his faith, for his grit, for his refusal to let go, God rewards Job with twice as much stuff as he had before. He is blessed again with children, with 7 sons and 3 daughters, just as he had before, and the book ends that way. It is a book with the beginning of a tragedy, and then the long middle section where Job is asking questions and his friends are trying to answer the questions, and then he has an encounter with God, and then the book ends with him being restored. I think now is a good time for us to ask the question, is Job a historical figure? Is the book of Job just a biography of some guy that lived way back when? And I think the answer is yes and no. As you see, I told you this book wasn't going to have simple answers here. You may know that the book has a prose beginning and a prose ending. And so what you just heard read to you was in prose, but all of the speeches of Job's friends and all of Job's speeches and all of God's response to Job are all written in poetry. And I don't know about you, but when I'm really hurting and I'm asking questions, I'm not really led to quote poetry or to create poetry. The words that come out of my mouth are not usually very poetic when I'm really hurting. And yet Job and his friends speak to each other in that way. And clearly that's not a typical biography or a typical history. The author of Job, and Job likely came down as an oral history for hundreds, if not thousands of years before it was eventually written down. And of course, many ancient oral histories came down as poetry. It made it a little easier to understand or to remember, but it also, poetry and art has a way of being so much deeper than just the flat prose sitting on a page. We talked just last week in our Bible study about how hymns can hit our hearts so deeply. And in Philippians 2, Paul quotes a hymn, not just because he had run out of stuff to say, but because he was really trying to help the Philippians really be hit very deeply in their hearts as well as in their heads with what he was trying to say to them. And the same is true with poetry. I mean, which is the more powerful line? Why does your last name have to be Montague? And would you leave your past for me? Or the line, and of course you didn't recognize that probably, but here's the line you do recognize. Romeo, O Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse your name. The poetry makes it stick, and even though you may not know any other lines from Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, you probably knew that line. And in that line, Juliet is saying, why do you have to be named Romeo, really Montague, your last name? Because the Montagues and the Capulets are at war. And so I'm asking you, would you be willing to deny your name, who you are, your family, so that you can be with me? Powerful, powerful, but much more powerful in the poetry than it is in the prose. And so at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter whether Job was a historical figure or not. My guess is that there was a story that followed the contours of Job's story, and it may be that at one point somebody added to that story and added some of this middle stuff. It may be that someone knew about Job, this actual historical character, and created this entire work, and then it became this oral literature that was passed down from mouth to mouth and from age to age. It doesn't really matter, that part, because what does matter is Job absolutely is real. We all know people who it seems like their whole lives have been lives of suffering. And we probably know people who have been willing to ask the hard questions. And if you're like me, you have been perhaps from time to time like Job's friends, where you just want them to quit asking all those questions, quit causing all of that trouble, and just get with the program, and yet they just can't. And actually God rewards them and not Job's friends. And it may even be that you have had times, and I know all of us have had times in our lives where we felt like we were Job. Everything was falling apart, and we didn't know why, and we didn't know what we were going to do, and we didn't know where God was. And so Job offers us opportunities to ask questions, to ultimately find answers, although they may not be exactly the answers that we would like, and they certainly are not going to be simplistic answers. They're not going to fit on a bumper sticker, if you will. Well, the main characters in the book obviously are God and Job, but we can't miss the fact that the first chapter features very prominently Satan. And so I want us to think about those three characters for the rest of our study today. And the book begins with Job, and most of us know that he was wealthy, and that may be one of the first things that we think about. But of course, the book begins by saying he was blameless and upright, even though a really better translation wouldn't use the word blameless, because as I already mentioned, he wasn't sinless, and he never says that he was sinless. Instead, what is really captured there in the Hebrew, and I should mention that the Hebrew in Job, of course, is some of the most complicated Hebrew that we have in the Old Testament, partly because it is poetry. That makes it harder to translate from the Hebrew into the English and retain the poetry and retain the meaning. But the Hebrew there would really better be translated that he was on the right path, that he was really headed in the right direction. And we can think about Psalm 23. He leadeth me in right paths for his name's sake. Job is on the right paths, and he's on the right paths for the sake of God. And that's a good thing. And he's upright, and the way I see upright simply is he can hold his head up. He's not saying he's perfect, but he can hold his head up high. He has nothing to be ashamed of. And that's what the author wants us to get right there at the beginning. But not only is he on the right path, he is blessed almost beyond comprehension. 7 sons, and 7, of course, is a complete number. To top that, he has 3 daughters as well. Thousands of heads of livestock of every kind of variety. He demonstrates his faithfulness, as already mentioned, by getting up, particularly on days that his children are going to have feasts. And it's interesting, Job and Mrs. Job don't seem to be invited to the feast, just the children. But when the children have these feasts, Job gets up early. And getting up early is a way of saying that I'm going to do something out of extreme intention. Getting up early and then making sacrifice for the children, just in case there's some sin they've committed that they're not aware of, that God might punish, or just in case beliefs, and here's where the Hebrew gets a little tricky. They have either cursed God in their hearts, which is how most translations render it, but actually the Hebrew says perhaps they accidentally praised God in their hearts. And it doesn't mean that they were faithful, they were praising God. What it really means is what we would say is they give God lip service. Maybe they praised God, but they didn't really mean it. That's the way that we take the name of the Lord in vain, and they would have as well, although the Ten Commandments weren't there yet, of course, at that time. But Job wanted to make sure that they weren't just giving God lip service and that they were truly praising God, because to give God simply lip service and to praise God and then to go out and be ugly to a neighbor or to harm someone is actually to curse God, because it's to say, well, I'll praise you if I think that I can manipulate you somehow, but I'm really not willing to live in the way that you want me to. And so Job gets up early and he makes sacrifice for his children because he wants to make sure that they are okay. And very interestingly, then when his wife says, just curse God and die, there's a sense in which the very thing Job has been trying to keep his children from doing, his wife is asking him to do. And the rest of the book, Job is trying to make a decision. Do I just go ahead and curse God and die? Do I just go ahead and not even give God lip service, but just be done with God altogether? And he's going to prove just how deep his faith is by refusing to do that. He never doubts that God is, even though he does sometimes doubt God's judgment perhaps, or God's goodness. He never doubts that God is. He never doubts that God will listen to him, but he is not sure God is listening to him. And he demonstrates that he really wants and believes that God has skin in the game. And I use that term because one of the most familiar verses in all of Job is, I know that my Redeemer lives, and one day he will stand upon the land. And we as Christians see that as a reference to Christ, God coming to us in the flesh as our Redeemer to stand upon the land with us. And that's not exactly what Job was looking for. Job was kind of looking for a defense attorney who would come and plead his case. But there's a sense in which Jesus does that for us as well. And we're told in Romans 8 that he intercedes for us. And so there is a sense in which Jesus does that for us as well. Well, it's interesting that I mentioned that Job is looking for a sort of a defender, a public defender, or an attorney to defend him, because the picture that we get of God here in this first chapter of Job is God in sort of a heavenly courtroom, or really even better put, kind of like when the President of the United States is in the cabinet room, and the whole cabinet is there in the room together, and each department is making a report. The Department of Agriculture makes their report, and the Defense Department makes their report, and as a cabinet together, they're deciding what needs to be done and what actions they ought to take, and ultimately the decisions are there for the president, but the cabinet is giving their opinions, giving their reports. And that's what's going on in the first chapter of Job. And we might ask ourselves, now we're glad that the President of the United States has good, strong, intelligent people surrounding him to help him make decisions, because nobody can know everything, and so he needs these cabinet members. But God doesn't need that. God knows everything. God doesn't need to send out these cabinet members onto the earth to find out how things are going and to come back and make reports. Why does God do that? Why doesn't God just handle everything? John Goldingay again says something I think is really powerful. He says, I wouldn't be surprised if this tendency of God allowing not only the cabinet but us to be a part of God's work in the world, I wouldn't be surprised if it arises out of a delight in sharing responsibility that instead of insisting that one does everything oneself. In other words, it is an expression of love. And that brings us to Satan. In most translations, this word is capitalized, and we assume, usually in this story, that the Satan that we encounter is the same Satan that we're going to encounter again in the New Testament when Satan tempts Jesus. And we can almost see Satan tempting God almost in some ways in the same way that Satan tempts Jesus in the New Testament. And then Satan is a huge figure, of course, in the book of Revelation. And then we can also go backwards and go into Genesis and see in Genesis 2 the serpent perhaps is Satan, although the serpent is never identified as Satan, tempting Adam and Eve. We also remember that Jesus tells his disciples at one point, I saw Satan cast out of heaven. And so we wonder, well, when did that happen? Was that after this encounter we have here with Job, or was Satan allowed back into heaven, or what is going on? And I think that those are good questions that we need to ask ourselves. I'm going to give you a couple of opportunities or a couple of answers, and you can kind of decide for yourself what you think the answer may be. George Estes, who is the author of our Bible study, wonders, and I love this suggestion he has. Perhaps it is the same being, and in the scriptures we kind of see Satan slowly devolving, getting more and more and more evil. And so he's kind of testing the waters with Adam and Eve a little bit, and then when he comes here during the time of Job, he is again trying to cause problems and difficulties for Job, and we see he doesn't know. He's not all-knowing, and that's really important for us to recognize, because we tend to see Satan and God as equals, and they aren't. Satan is a part of creation like you and I are. And so Estes has a point here. Maybe he continues to evolve, and the sin that he's wrapped himself in continues to twist him, not unlike or kind of like a Gollum in the Lord of the Rings, how when he first gets the ring, he is not twisted, but as time passes, he gets more and more and more twisted. Perhaps that is true of Satan as well. And so we see him in the New Testament even more twisted as he's tempting Jesus, and then eventually in the book of Revelation we see him at his very, very worst. Interesting, fascinating. Not sure I buy it completely, but I like it. I like that idea. Another possibility is these simply aren't all the same being. From the very beginning, we know that there are some heavenly beings and some human beings who are not going to go along with God's plan, or are going to rebel against God's plan. It's not simply Satan, the one, but it's many, and we know that it's many. And so the serpent may have been one being that departed from God's will. The Satan in Job may be another, and then the Satan in the New Testament may be another as well, and that is possible. And then it may be that the one in Job is really a little different from all of the other ones. He's a part of the cabinet, and actually, rather than being capitalized as a person's name, it may be this is his title. In Hebrew, Satan simply means adversary. And actually in Hebrew, there probably is or should be a definite article. It is the Satan that comes to God. And so it's almost like when the district attorney or the attorney general is making his report. Well, I've been out on earth, and I'm not the agricultural department official, head of the agriculture department, and so I don't know anything about the crops, but here's what I can tell you. We got a problem down there with Job, because he thinks that he is blessed because he is so upright and righteous. But what I'm telling you, God, is if you take that stuff away from him, he's going to curse you. He's not nearly as good as you think he is, and I think he needs to be tested. And so he is an adversary in the same way that our legal system is an adversarial system. It doesn't mean that the prosecuting attorney is evil or that the defense attorney is evil, but they both have different jobs, and their jobs ultimately are to find justice and to seek justice, but they do it in slightly different ways. A prosecuting attorney is trying to find justice for victims, and a defense attorney is trying to make sure that even if a person is guilty, that they receive the correct justice in our system, that they aren't just taken out and lynched or whatever, but that they're given due process and have all of the rights that they are supposed to have afforded to them. But that happens in an adversarial relationship. And so it may simply be that the Satan says, I've got my doubts about Job, and I think we need to test Job. And in what is a great mystery, God agrees. And we don't want to see God as one who says, oh, callously, go ahead and hurt Job and do all of these things. And doesn't only hurt Job, but hurts his family, killing his children, taking away everything that he has, his servants as well. Many of them are killed, and then ultimately affecting his own body as well. We don't want to see God as one who tortures, and God doesn't do any torturing here, but God does allow it to happen. And we need to recognize that even in our own lives, in great mystery, God could stop any of the difficult things that we've gone through from happening. But in what is a mystery, God chooses not to. And we have some indications of why that is. Paul tells us that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and that will never disappoint us. And we're also told, Paul in the same chapter, that God can work all things together for good for them who love him. And most of us who've been through difficult situations have found ways to make those situations teach us important lessons and give us compassion for other people, and maybe have given us a passion to act out on behalf behalf of other people who maybe are in similar situations. And so we see that God doesn't exempt us from all evil or exempt us from all difficult things, not because God wants to see us tortured, but because God can use it to grow us. But that doesn't make it any easier when we're going through it, and it doesn't mean that we aren't allowed to ask questions, as Job will tell us. So Job is an example of a man whose faith makes a difference in his life. But he's also a man who has to hang on to his faith almost against all odds and against all costs. And we begin with this mystery. Why would God do such a thing if God already knows Job's heart? But as we began, this is a book about real experiences, and we know that God knows our hearts as well, and God knows, as hopefully we know, we are not sinless, and Job never claims to be sinless, and yet sometimes some of the things that happen to us in life feel like they are not fair, and maybe they are not fair, and God doesn't ever say to Job that what happened to you was fair, that you deserved it. That certainly isn't a part of Job at all. And so, like Job, we need to recognize that we need to find a way to be willing to ask the tough, difficult questions, even if we don't get initial answers. If we have friends that can't seem to give us answers that seem to work for us, it's okay to ask questions of them, including your pastor or other theologians. If it's not working for you, that's okay. Keep asking the question, but recognize that as long as I'm asking God a question, I'm making some assumptions. I'm assuming that God is listening or will listen. I'm assuming that God cares about me. I'm assuming that there is someone out there that I can ask those questions to. And if we do those things, I think it's very important that we recognizing that is ultimately the basis of faith. And so we will see and meet some of Job's friends next week. But for this time, for this day, let me suggest that you think about some of the difficult times in your life and think about some of the ways that God was present or perhaps was not present for you in those times. And then think about what can you do with that now at this time. Is there some calls you need to adopt or pick up? Is there some phone you need to pick up and call someone? Is there something you need to do in response to the difficult time in your life, so that our study of the scriptures each and every week will cause us to do or be something that God wants us to do or to be? And we can do this because in spite of all of his questions and in spite of all of his arguments, Job is a wonderful witness to the fact that God is with us. Amen.